Welcome to a discussion on the control of nuisance animals in the garden and landscape. My name is Phil Ridebush. I'm an Extension Master Gardener volunteer in Buncombe County, North Carolina, a retired veterinarian, and a certified Blue Ridge naturalist through the North Carolina Arboretum. I enjoy talking about nuisance animals in the garden because of my background and long-term interest in gardening, veterinary medicine, and natural history. In this presentation, we'll focus on wildlife resources, those resources other than this video that you can use to access information about nuisance wildlife, talk about the concepts of integrated pest management or IPM and how it relates to nuisance animals, and then talk a little bit about some of the legal considerations. This presentation is part of a series of 9 gardening videos on nuisance animals that also includes information on the other topics listed here. If you're having problems with a specific type of animal, you may want to watch one or more of these videos. All these videos can be found on the Buncombe County Master Gardener website, and that's buncombe-mastergardener.org. So let's get started. As mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on wildlife resources, integrated pest management, and then some of the legal considerations to think about with animal control in the garden. With regard to wildlife resources, one of the first places to look in North Carolina is information available through North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service. And one of those is the North Carolina Extension Gardener Handbook. This is available to purchase as a hardcover book, or each of the chapters is available electronically online by going to ces.ncsu.edu and searching on the chapter in question. Chapter 20 in the handbook talks about wildlife, not only talks about how to attract wildlife to your home or landscape, but also about how to manage nuisance wildlife. And that's a good resource to begin with. Secondly, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission is responsible for regulating and managing wildlife in the state of North Carolina. They have an excellent website that you can find at ncwildlife.org. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the information that's available there. In addition to information through North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service, the University of Florida has some excellent monographs and information about managing nuisance wildlife through their extension service. So if you search on IFAS or University of Florida Extension, they have monographs on identifying nuisance wildlife, managing habitat, traps, and specifically coping with deer. And finally, as mentioned earlier, there's a series of 8 other videos at the Buncombe Master Gardener website that talks more about information about individual animals that might be causing problems. As I mentioned, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission has an excellent website, ncwildlife.org, and there's several sources of information there. If you're having a problem with a specific wildlife species, they have a whole section called Have a Wildlife Problem? Again, you can access directly by going to ncwildlife.org/have-a-problem, and so that can be very helpful. They also have information about how to deal with injured and orphaned wildlife, how to prevent wildlife conflicts, and then quite a bit of detailed information about individual wildlife species, which includes a range map within the state of North Carolina, an overview of the species, problems you might have with that particular wildlife species, and then general management recommendations that may include trapping, relocation, and hunting. So next, let's move on and talk about integrated pest management. A pest is defined as any living organism that's causing problems in your home, garden, or landscape. We typically think of insects as being the primary pest that we deal with, but certainly wildlife and other animals fit the definition of a pest when they become a nuisance. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to pest management that again includes nuisance animals, and it relies on a combination of common sense practices. Its goal is to manage, in this case, animal damage by the most economical means and with the least possible hazard to people, property, and the environment. And really, IPM is not a single pest control method, but it's really a series of pest management evaluations, decisions, and controls. I like how it's depicted here as a pyramid. And when we think about IPM for nuisance animals as well as other pests, think about trying to focus our activities at the bottom of the pyramid. What can we do to help prevent that pest from becoming established? These are usually more benign procedures, such as changing our horticultural or cultural aspects, mechanical and physical, biological, and then at the tip of the pyramid, what we would probably like to do least often is use chemical management. A good example of that would be chemical repellents, and in some cases, lethal intervention. So integrated pest management, step one is assess the damage. And what you need to ask yourself is how much damage can I tolerate before I try to intervene? And this is also sometimes called an action threshold. At what level am I going to institute some management techniques? And as an example of that, I hear a couple of different instances of damage from deer. And on the left, we have some sweet corn. Maybe you're growing sweet corn in your garden, and occasionally you'll have deer that will eat part of the sweet corn ear. And if that only happens a couple of times into a couple of corn plants, you're probably not going to institute any management strategy. On the other hand, if we look at these shrubs on the right-hand picture, you can see that they've been extensively damaged from browsing by deer. And this is probably a level of damage that's unacceptable. It probably exceeds the action threshold, and we're going to want to think about how can we manage this nuisance problem. On a personal note, I kind of face this. When I lived in Kansas a number of years ago, I had a large vegetable garden, about 1,800 square feet, and also established a pumpkin patch that was in a horse arena that was no longer being used, and I would grow about 10 to 15 different varieties of gourds and pumpkins. So in the fall, when I harvested the gourds and pumpkins, I would usually have 200 to 300 gourds and pumpkins, so a nice harvest. And during the year, during the growing season, I would usually have about 10 to 15 of the pumpkins that would be damaged from wildlife, usually raccoons or coyotes, sometimes some other animals. And I really considered that to be an acceptable level of damage. So to only lose 10 or 15 pumpkins out of several hundred, I thought was acceptable. And so I didn't really institute any other management technique. On the other hand, in my vegetable garden that was actually nearby, I had quite a bit of problem, primarily from rabbits and deer. I found that after a couple of years of battling deer and rabbits, I paid to have a very nice fence put in, and that eliminated that problem. So with regard to my vegetable garden, I found that I couldn't tolerate or didn't want to tolerate the damage that was occurring there. On the other hand, losing a few pumpkins was not an issue. IPM step 3 is to initiate preventive measures, and I'll show some examples of that. Prevention really should be your first line of defense. You can remove brush or wood piles near buildings or gardens, because these might be a good place for wildlife to create a nest or to remain. Secondly, seal off garbage cans, clean recycling containers, and only put containers out the day of collection. Animals like opossums and raccoons and bears are attracted to unsecured garbage. Thirdly, you can secure or remove food sources such as pet food or wild bird seed and to feed pets indoors. And these are great ways to attract things like opossums, raccoons, foxes, coyotes, and bears. As a personal story, I had a neighbor who fed two feral cats, and she kept a bowl of cat food outside for them all the time. And we were having lots of raccoon problems. I had raccoon problems in the garden and climbing up on my deck and causing problems. When she moved away, she was captured and took the cats with her. She was no longer feeding cat food outdoors, and my raccoon problems went away. So I would be convinced that they were being attracted to my neighbor's house and just happened to cause problems with me along the way. So again, securing or removing those food sources can be very important. Certainly creating barriers around prized plants or landscape beds, or in this case, a tree, can be very important to prevent damage from deer and other animals. And finally, you want to block off decks, porches, roofs, and basement access points. Animals like skunks and groundhogs love to create burrows if there's already an existing opening. And finally, with regards to deer, you can plant deer-resistant landscapes as a key preventive measure. There is a separate video on creating and maintaining deer-resistant landscapes. If you're interested in that, I encourage you to look at that other video. Temporary scare tactics can be used, but there's little evidence that they are effective long-term. Flash tape, noisemakers, scarecrows are most effective if they're moved every few days. Motion lights are only effective temporarily, and flashing or strobe lights probably work best. Motion detectors with spray or sprinklers can be very effective. Another temporary scare tactic is the availability of dogs in your yard or neighborhood. They can be very effective at scaring away deer and other wildlife. As an example, my daughter lives in an area that has moderate to high deer pressure, but they have two dogs that run in a fenced-in backyard and rarely had deer problems when the dogs were around. Last summer, they went on vacation for a couple of weeks, took the dogs with them, and when they came back, they found they had extensive deer browse damage to hostas, shrubbery, and other animals, probably because the dogs had not been there to scare the animal away. IPM step 5 is to manage the nuisance animal effectively. And you want to use management techniques that are directed to the animal of concern, which means that step of identifying the culprit appropriately is a very important first step. If you're using live or lethal traps or hunting, please realize that there are many legal requirements for wildlife control. So you're encouraged to consult ncwildlife.org for specific information. If you're using repellents, they also need to be used appropriately. And I would encourage you to look at the video that specifically talks about repellents. And finally, evaluate your strategy, see if it's been effective, and if so, continue that, and if not, look for alternative methods of control. So that's a brief overview of integrated pest management, or IPM. Again, we'd like to focus most of our efforts at the bottom of the pyramid, those things that are more preventive in nature, more benign, and then work our way up the pyramid for the appropriate nuisance animal. And finally, let's talk about legal considerations. The important thing to remember is that virtually all the nuisance animal species that we're talking about are protected or regulated at some level, usually by state or federal laws. We don't have to worry about that so much with other pests. So an example is an insect pest. An insect pest is usually not a protected species, so we don't worry about that. But anytime we're considering nuisance animals and their management, we need to think about the legal considerations. As an example is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which was first enacted in 1916 to implement the Convention for the Protection of Migratory Birds between the United States and Canada, and has subsequently been extended to include Mexico, Japan, and Russia. It was one of the first federal environmental laws enacted, and it makes it unlawful without waiver to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, or sell birds listed as migratory species, and that includes their feathers, their eggs, and their nests, and there are over 800 species currently on the list. So if you want more information about birds, you can look at that appropriate video, but this is an example of where you need to be aware of the legal considerations if birds are being a nuisance. As mentioned earlier, hunting and trapping are highly regulated activities. Again, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission is responsible for that. For more information, go to ncwildlife.org if you're considering any type of hunting or trapping activity. With regard to trapping, the typical trapping season is in the winter months, typically November, December, January, and either February or March. You can trap during that period of time yourself or hire a licensed trapper. During close season, in other words, the other months of the year, you can trap an animal. If there's ongoing property damage, if you do it yourself, you need to obtain a depredation permit or hire a wildlife control agent. Relocation really varies tremendously among species. So permission to relocate after live trapping varies. For example, relocation for groundhogs is not permitted, while relocation of gray squirrels to personal property is okay with the permission of the landowner. But relocation of live animals to either state or federal land is strictly prohibited. So again, live trapping an animal, releasing it in the national forest is illegal. Hunting regulations vary quite a bit by species. So for a possum, raccoon, rabbit, and squirrel, the season is typically mid-October through February or March. Open season, meaning that you can hunt any time of the year, for armadillo, coyote, striped skunk, groundhog, and beaver. Turkeys are highly regulated, usually from early April to early May. May vary from year to year. And bear, deer, and fox are also highly regulated, and legal or hunting regulations may vary even by county to county. So again, you're encouraged to go to ncwildlife.org for more details. So that's what I wanted to cover with you today. We've talked about some additional resources you can use if you're dealing with nuisance animals or wildlife. We talked a little bit about IPM and the concepts there, and we talked about some of the legal ramifications of dealing with wildlife as well. And I hope this has given you a few ideas or tips about each of these topics. If you need additional help or have questions, you can contact the Garden Helpline in Buncombe County during the growing season from March through October. You can call or visit the Extension office. One of the easiest ways is just submit questions or problems to buncomemg@gmail.com. And not only can you submit your question, but you can submit pictures of plants or pests or plant diseases, and that will help answer your questions as well. Thanks for joining me, and happy gardening.